Imagine you are sitting around a fire with 30 people. These are the only 30 people in your world. You have no police, no courts, no jails, no written laws, no government, no judge, no executioner. And someone in your group just did something that threatened everyone. They stole food from a communal cache during a shortage. They attacked another member unprovoked. They repeatedly took more than their share. They lied in a way that put lives at risk. What happens next? This question cuts to the heart of something most people never think about. How did your ancestors living in small mobile bands for 300,000 years enforce the rules that held their societies together? Without any of the institutions modern civilization has built around justice and punishment, how did ancient humans actually deal with people who broke the social contract? The answer is not chaos, and it is not brutality. It is something far more sophisticated, far more psychologically precise, and in many ways far more effective than what modern criminal justice systems have managed to build in thousands of years of trying. Your ancestors had a system, and it worked. To understand it, you have to understand what law enforcement actually is, stripped of all its modern apparatus. At its core, enforcing social rules in a small group is about one thing: making the cost of antisocial behavior greater than the benefit. In a modern state, the cost is usually external: police, courts, prisons. The punishment comes from outside. In a hunter-gatherer band, the cost was almost entirely internal: social, reputational, psychological. And for a creature as deeply social as Homo sapiens, a species whose survival depended absolutely on group membership, social cost was not a mild deterrent. It was existential. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm, whose landmark 2012 book Hierarchy in the Forest analyzed dozens of hunter-gatherer societies across the globe, identified a consistent pattern of what he called reverse dominance hierarchies in egalitarian forager groups. Hunter-gatherer bands, he found, were not dominated by the strongest or most aggressive individuals. They were actively, collectively organized to prevent any single person from dominating others. The group policed status. The group kept things flat. And when someone threatened that flatness, when someone tried to accumulate disproportionate power, resources, or influence, the group responded. Together. In stages. The first stage was the mildest, and it was devastatingly effective: criticism. In hunter-gatherer communities studied by anthropologists including Richard Lee among the Yankung San of the Kalahari, open verbal criticism of a norm violator was the first and most common response to antisocial behavior. This was not mild social disapproval. This was direct, public, group-sanctioned confrontation, carried out in front of everyone, in the small group where everyone's opinion mattered enormously, where reputation was one of the most valuable things a person could possess. The Kungsan practiced what Lee called insulting the meat, a deliberate cultural tradition in which a successful hunter's kill is publicly downplayed, minimized, even mocked, specifically to prevent the hunter from developing an inflated sense of importance. This is not cruelty. It is maintenance. The group actively works to keep anyone from believing themselves too important to the rules. When criticism alone was not enough, the second stage began. Ridicule. Sustained, public, collective mockery of a norm violator served multiple functions simultaneously. It reduced the social status of the violator in ways that were difficult to reverse. It signaled to the entire group where the collective stood. It made continued norm violation increasingly costly. And it required no authority, no institution, no designated enforcer. It emerged from the group organically. Evolutionary psychologist Michael Price has written extensively on how public shaming in ancestral environments functioned as one of the most powerful behavioral regulators available to small social groups. The human response to social shame? Shame that is public, that affects one's entire relational world, that cannot be escaped by moving to a new city or changing social circles, is neurologically and psychologically among the most powerful aversive experiences a human being can have. In a group of 30 people on the African savanna, shame had nowhere to hide. If ridicule was insufficient, the group moved to the third stage: ostracism, partial or complete social withdrawal from a norm violator. People stopped sharing food with them, stopped including them in conversations, stopped offering help. In a community where resource sharing, information exchange, and cooperative labor were the difference between survival and death, being cut out of the network was not a metaphorical punishment. It was a real and immediate threat to life. Anthropological research across dozens of forager groups, from the Hadza of Tanzania studied by Frank Marlowe to the Ache of Paraguay studied by Kim Hill, consistently shows that ostracism and social exclusion were used as graduated responses to norm violation. And they were effective precisely because the stakes were real. There was no alternative social network, there was no other group to join. You had your band, or you had nothing. But what about serious violations? What about violence? What about the person who, despite all social pressure, continued to threaten the group? This is where the picture becomes both darker and more illuminating. Boehm's research found that across hunter-gatherer societies, the ultimate sanction for persistent, serious norm violation, particularly repeated unprovoked violence, or behavior that constituted an ongoing threat to group safety, was execution. Not by a designated executioner, not by a court-appointed authority. By the group, collectively, often by close kin of the violator to prevent blood feuds. This form of collective capital punishment has been documented across a remarkable range of unconnected hunter-gatherer societies. The Tart Kung San, the Inuit, the Aboriginal Australians, the Hadza, and many others. In each case, the pattern is similar. The violation is serious. The social tools have failed. The group reaches a collective decision, often through extended discussion around the fire, the kind of evening consensus building that anthropologist Polly Wiesner documented in her research on Kung San campfire conversation. And the execution is carried out as a community act, spreading both the moral responsibility and the practical consequence across the group. What is striking about this system is not its brutality, it is its proportionality. Hunter-gatherer justice was not punitive in the modern sense. It was not interested in retribution or deterrence at scale. It was surgical. The goal at every stage was to restore equilibrium to the group. Criticism first, then ridicule, then ostracism, then, only when the threat was genuine and the other tools had failed, removal. And the threshold for that final sanction was high. Boehm found that the behaviors most consistently triggering collective execution across hunter-gatherer cultures were not petty violations. They were patterns of repeated violence, particularly by individuals who had demonstrated that they could not or would not be regulated by social pressure, what Boehm called headmen, bullies, or self-aggrandizers who repeatedly threatened to dominate others. The egalitarianism of hunter-gatherer society was not passive. It was actively defended. There is something else the archaeological and anthropological record reveals about ancient justice that modern legal systems have largely abandoned. Restoration. In many forager societies, the goal after a violation was not primarily punishment of the violator, but repair of the relationship and the group. Mediation between parties was common. Public reconciliation was practiced. The Spach Kung San had elaborate formalized processes for working through grievances that involved extended community discussion, acknowledgement of harm, and negotiated resolution. James Suzman, the anthropologist who spent decades living among the Jew hoansi people of the Kalahari, one of the most studied traditional forager societies on Earth, has written about the remarkable sophistication of their conflict resolution mechanisms, noting that the absence of accumulation and the enforced equality of their social structure removed many of the conditions that create irresolvable conflict in the first place. When there is little to accumulate, there is less to fight over. When everyone depends on everyone else, the costs of unresolved conflict are borne by all, creating powerful collective incentives for resolution. So what actually happened to ancient humans who broke the rules? They were talked about. Loudly. In public. In front of everyone. They were mocked. Persistently. Until it hurt. They were excluded. Gradually. Until survival itself became uncertain. And in the most serious cases, after all other tools had failed, they were removed. By the collective in a decision that belonged to everyone and no one. It was not a perfect system. It produced its own injustices. Social pressure can be turned against the innocent. Consensus can be manufactured by the powerful. Ostracism can destroy people who do not deserve it. But for 300,000 years in small bands of people who could not survive alone, it was the only system your ancestors had. And for most of human history, it worked well enough to hold everything together. The fire is still burning, everyone is watching, and you already know before you do anything that there is nowhere to hide.